What if the most important thing a relationship reveals is not who the other person is, but who you become when they enter your life? There are connections that seem to touch something deeper than ordinary attraction. You meet someone, become emotionally invested, and suddenly, parts of yourself that were quiet for years begin to speak. Old fears appear. Questions about your worth become louder. You begin noticing how deeply you need reassurance, how difficult uncertainty is for you, or how easily you can lose yourself when you are afraid of losing someone else. And when the relationship becomes distant, the mind naturally asks one question: why did this happen? But Jungian psychology invites us to ask a different question. What did this relationship reveal about me? That question changes everything. Because sometimes we become so focused on understanding another person that we never stop to understand our own psychological reaction to them. We analyze their silence. We interpret their distance. We replay conversations. We search for hidden meanings. We wonder whether the connection was special, whether the separation was necessary, whether they will return, and whether everything happened for a reason. But while the mind is occupied with the other person, something much closer to home may be waiting for our attention. Your unconscious patterns, your fears, your expectations, your emotional history, and perhaps the part of yourself you have been avoiding. This is where Jungian psychology becomes especially powerful in relationships. Carl Jung's understanding of the unconscious suggests that much of our psychological life exists outside ordinary awareness. We can consciously believe that we are choosing someone because they are simply attractive, interesting, kind, or compatible. But beneath that conscious explanation, deeper emotional patterns may also be influencing what we feel. Sometimes we are drawn toward qualities that represent something missing within ourselves. Sometimes we project an image onto another person. Sometimes we confuse intensity with compatibility, because intensity activates something familiar inside us. And sometimes a relationship becomes powerful precisely because it touches a psychological complex that has been waiting to be recognized. Imagine someone who grew up learning that love had to be earned. Perhaps they learned to be useful, to please, to stay quiet, to avoid conflict, to give more than they received. Years later, they enter a relationship with someone emotionally distant. At first, the distance feels exciting. There is uncertainty, there is anticipation. There are moments of closeness followed by moments of withdrawal. And instead of recognizing the pattern as emotionally exhausting, they become even more attached. Why? Because the unconscious can sometimes mistake familiarity for safety. The person may not consciously want emotional uncertainty, but some deeper part of their psychological history already understands it. So they keep trying, they give more, they wait longer. They become increasingly focused on earning the affection they fear they might lose. And eventually, they may say, "I have never felt anything like this before." Perhaps that is true, but unusual intensity does not automatically mean extraordinary compatibility. Sometimes, intensity is a signal that something inside you has been activated. That does not make the connection meaningless. It makes it psychologically important. There is a profound difference. A person can be important to your psychological development without necessarily being the person you spend the rest of your life with. This is one of the hardest ideas to accept. We often measure the value of a relationship by its duration. If someone stayed, we assume the relationship mattered. If they left, we assume something went wrong. But psychological transformation does not follow that rule. Some encounters are brief and still change the direction of a person's life. A conversation can change you. A rejection can change you. A friendship can change you. A relationship can change you. Not because the other person possessed some supernatural role in your destiny, but because the experience forced you to encounter something inside yourself that you could no longer ignore. And this is where the idea of projection becomes important. Projection occurs when aspects of our own inner world become experienced as though they belong entirely to someone else. In relationships, this can be incredibly powerful. You may look at another person and see confidence, emotional depth, strength, freedom, tenderness, or certainty. You become fascinated by them. You think, they have something I don't. But perhaps what you are seeing is partly an unconscious image of something that exists within your own psychological potential. The person may have awakened an aspect of yourself that you had not developed. This is why certain people can feel strangely magnetic, not necessarily because they are destined for you, but because they symbolize something psychologically significant. They may represent the person you want to become. They may embody qualities you have suppressed. They may challenge an identity you have outgrown. They may expose a conflict between the person you present to the world and the person you secretly want to become. Jung called the social identity we present to the world the persona. The persona is not necessarily false. It is the role we learn to function within society. You may be the strong one, the responsible one, the independent one, the person who never needs help, the person who always understands everyone else. But what happens when you meet someone who makes you feel vulnerable? Suddenly, the carefully controlled persona begins to crack. You discover that beneath your independence is a fear of abandonment. Beneath your confidence is a need for reassurance. Beneath your calm exterior is a deep desire to be understood. And this can be frightening, because we often prefer relationships that confirm who we already believe we are. But psychologically significant relationships can challenge that identity. They can show us what the persona was protecting. This is one reason separation can become so psychologically intense. When the relationship disappears, the external object of your attention disappears with it. And suddenly, you are left with yourself. No message to analyze, no conversation to replay, no behavior to interpret, no person to use as a reference point for your emotional state. At first, that silence can feel unbearable, but eventually, something interesting can happen. You begin hearing yourself, you begin noticing the thoughts underneath the obsession. You ask, what am I actually afraid of? Why does their distance affect my sense of worth? Why do I feel incomplete without their attention? Why did I tolerate things that I would tell someone I love never to tolerate? These questions may hurt, but they can also become the beginning of psychological growth. Because self-awareness often begins where self-deception ends. Perhaps you were not only grieving the person, perhaps you were grieving the future you imagined with them. Perhaps you were attached not only to who they were, but to who you hoped they would become. Perhaps you were attached to the feeling of being chosen. Perhaps you were attached to the possibility that this person could finally prove something you had spent years trying to prove about yourself. And this is where idealization can become dangerous. We can turn another person into a psychological symbol. We remember their best moments. We minimize the difficult ones. We imagine conversations that never happened. We create explanations for their behavior. We build a version of them inside our minds that may be very different from the actual human being. The more uncertainty exists, the more imagination can fill the gaps, and then we may become attached to our own psychological creation. This is why silence can become so powerful. Silence contains very little factual information, but the unconscious mind hates empty spaces, so it fills them. They must be thinking about me. They are probably afraid. They will eventually realize what they lost. They are staying away because the connection is too intense. Maybe, but you do not know. And psychological maturity means learning to distinguish possibility from fact. That distinction protects you from turning uncertainty into obsession. Jungian psychology is not about convincing yourself that every painful relationship has a predetermined ending. It is about becoming conscious, and consciousness requires honesty. Sometimes the honest answer is, I don't know what they feel. I don't know why they left. I don't know whether they will return. But I can know what this experience is doing inside me. I can know what I am learning. I can know what patterns I am repeating. I can know what boundaries I need. I can know what kind of relationship I am capable of creating. That is where your power actually begins, not in controlling another person's behavior, in understanding your own. Think about the difference between attachment and connection. Attachment can say, I need you to choose me so I can feel valuable. Connection says, I value you, but I do not have to abandon myself to keep you. Attachment can say, your silence determines how I feel today. Connection says, I can care about you and still remain emotionally grounded. Attachment can say, if you leave, I have lost everything. Connection says, if you leave, I will grieve, but I will not lose myself. That distinction represents enormous psychological growth. And it does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean pretending you do not care. It does not mean suppressing love. It means learning to love without making another human being responsible for your entire emotional existence. This is close to the deeper movement Jung associated with individuation. Individuation is not simply becoming independent from everyone. It is becoming more fully yourself. It means developing a relationship with the parts of your personality you have ignored, rejected, or projected onto other people. And relationships can accelerate that process. Someone may enter your life and reveal your shadow. Not because they are deliberately trying to hurt you, but because their presence activates qualities or emotions that you have difficulty accepting in yourself. Maybe they make you jealous. Maybe they make you insecure. Maybe they make you angry. Maybe they make you desperate for approval. Instead of immediately making the other person responsible for those feelings, you can become curious. What is this emotion trying to tell me? That question is more powerful than, how do I make them change? Because your emotions contain information. Jealousy may reveal fear. Anger may reveal a violated boundary. Anxiety may reveal uncertainty. Desperation may reveal emotional dependence. Idealization may reveal an unmet need. And loneliness may reveal that you have been expecting one relationship to provide everything your inner world needs. This is why a painful relationship can become a mirror. The mirror does not necessarily tell you what the other person is. It tells you what happens inside you when you encounter them. That is a very different kind of knowledge. And once you see it, you can begin changing the pattern. Maybe you realize you have always chased emotionally unavailable people. Maybe you realize you confuse being needed with being loved. Maybe you realize you say yes when you mean no because you fear rejection. Maybe you realize that you have been trying to convince someone to value you because you have not fully valued yourself. These realizations can be painful, but pain is not always evidence that something is wrong. Sometimes, pain is the sensation of becoming conscious of something that was previously hidden. The goal is not to romanticize suffering. The goal is to learn from it. There is an important difference. You do not need to stay in unhealthy relationships to grow. You do not need to tolerate disrespect because a connection feels intense. You do not need to interpret anxiety as proof of destiny. You do not need to chase someone simply because losing them activated deep emotions. Psychological growth can happen through leaving. It can happen through setting a boundary. It can happen through accepting reality. It can happen through saying, I love this person, but this relationship is not healthy for me. That sentence requires enormous strength. Because sometimes maturity means accepting that feelings and compatibility are not the same thing. You can care deeply about someone and still recognize that the relationship cannot provide what you need. You can appreciate what someone awakened in you without needing to possess them. You can be grateful for an experience without needing it to continue forever. And perhaps this is the deeper transformation that meaningful relationships can create. At the beginning, you may ask, are we meant to be together? Later, the question becomes, who am I becoming because of this experience? That is a much deeper question, because if your entire psychological journey depends on whether another person returns, you are still placing your future in their hands. But if you can say, whether they return or not, I will continue becoming more conscious, more grounded, and more honest with myself, then something inside you has changed. You are no longer waiting for another person to complete the story. You are writing your own. And if two people eventually reconnect, the healthiest reunion will not be built on desperation. It will not require mind games. It will not depend on testing each other's feelings. It will not need endless uncertainty to create excitement. A healthier relationship is more likely to contain something quieter. Consistency, respect, honest communication, mutual responsibility, boundaries, emotional maturity, the ability to disagree without destroying each other, the ability to give affection without using it as currency, the ability to be vulnerable without turning vulnerability into manipulation. That is what growth looks like in real life, not perfection, awareness. Two people who have learned more about themselves can meet differently because they are no longer asking the relationship to solve the psychological problems that existed before it. And sometimes there will be no reunion. This is perhaps the most difficult truth. A relationship can be meaningful without being permanent. A person can matter without remaining. A chapter can transform you without becoming the whole book. If someone leaves your life, it does not automatically mean the connection was false. And if